Is Mosharraf Zaidi. He's a senior fellow at the Tabadlab, a public policy think tank, and a former principal advisor to Pakistan's foreign minister. Mosharraf Zaidi, thanks for joining us.
Pleasure, thank you.
In August, it will be 1 year since Imran Khan became Prime Minister of Pakistan. Of course, he is a well-known figure, not just in Pakistan, but around the world as well. He's been a cricket superstar. But has he been able to make the transition from the sports field to the Prime Minister's office?
Well, in terms of winning the World Cup of Pakistani politics, like he won the World Cup of cricket in 1992, he finally got here after a 22, 23-year political struggle. Whether he's figured out what his job is and how he can do it best, I think that's a work in progress. The recent evidence suggests that he still has a way to go before he will seem comfortable in this new role as the country's most powerful leader.
As you say, it's a work in progress, but he made many promises before becoming Prime Minister. He promised to clamp down on corruption and nepotism. He promised to lift the poor, loosen the grip that the country's military has on power. What is your assessment of his performance so far?
Well, against the promises that he made, he hasn't been able to make very much progress because he's explicitly announced a reneging of many of those promises. Imran Khan promised that Pakistan would, if he was Prime Minister, he would rather commit suicide than to go to the IMF. He hasn't committed suicide, but Pakistan has gone to the IMF. He announced that it would be the end of the elite capture of this country's fiscal regime, that the rich would have to pay their fair share of taxes, but the super rich in Pakistan, especially the sugar lobby, many of whose representatives are part of his cabinet, are still firmly in control of the economy and the fiscal regime. He has promised changes in terms of how robustly Pakistan tackles poverty, education, and health, but at least the federal budget showed a lack of commitment on that front. The higher education budget is lower than it was last year. There is a fiscal crisis, of course, in the country. So most promises in the political realm, they require money to be kept. And of course, Pakistan doesn't have that much money. Now, how much of that is Imran Khan's fault? I think his supporters would debate that he was given a bad hand to begin with. I think his critics would say that 10 months into his role as Prime Minister, he should certainly be doing better than blaming his predecessors for the problems that he faces.
What do you make of his stewardship of the economy? As you point out, he had to go to the IMF to get a loan. He's had to impose austerity measures to get that loan. The country had set an economic growth target of 6.2%, but it missed that. It's only grown 3.2%.
Well, it's a massive miss, right? I mean, 3% in terms of GDP growth is a pretty substantial, it's a $10 billion miss, which happens to be, substantially more than what Pakistan is borrowing from the IMF. It's a $6 billion loan. Of course, the net borrowing isn't just from the IMF. Pakistan has had a more complicated relationship with China ever since Prime Minister Imran Khan became Prime Minister, a more complicated relationship with Iran, some degree of improvement with Saudi Arabia, with the United Arab Emirates, but in all of those cases, including Iran, one of the core issues of negotiation with these countries and Pakistan's relationship with them is how much money Pakistan might be able to borrow or attract in terms of investment. So it's been a rough ride. I don't think he's figured out the economy. He also had to get rid of his preferred finance minister because of the steep learning curve that the government was experiencing. But I don't think all hope is lost. I think that there is and continues to be a reform agenda. It's just a matter of whether or not Imran Khan will get to executing that reform agenda. And to get to that stage, he needs to understand how governance works. As I said, the most recent evidence suggests that he hasn't quite figured it out. But on one hand, it's been 10 months and people should be getting impatient. On the other hand, it's a 5-year term. And he's he's not yet completed the first year. So I think if we give him a little bit more time, we'll be able to figure out whether or not he's ever going to figure it out.
All right, you mentioned foreign policy. Let's focus on that for a moment. The new Prime Minister said in a tweet shortly after the re-election of the Indian Prime Minister, Narendra Modi, Imran Khans said in this tweet, "I congratulate Prime Minister Modi on the electoral victory of BJP and allies. Look forward to working with him for peace, progress and prosperity in South Asia." Now, there were some hopes that these two leaders would meet on the sidelines of the Shanghai Cooperation Summit, which is currently taking place in Kyrgyzstan, but India seems to have ruled that out. What are the chances of him improving relations with India?
I think that India is certainly going to try to demonstrate its role as a country that's grown out of the shadow of the India-Pakistan relationship. And it's tried to do that by being aggressive and assertive with Pakistan. But ultimately, the pressure that India faces on improving relations with Pakistan is multi-pronged. And one of the sources of pressure are the founders of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization itself, including China and Russia. Both powers believe that the world, and certainly this region and the SCO at large, will be better off when there is greater cooperation and greater trust between Pakistan and India. I think the Pakistanis understand that full well, and there is a coherence and a commitment both on the military side, which is extremely powerful in Pakistan, and the civilian side with the Prime Minister. That tweet wasn't the first time that he had positively reached out. Most, if not everything that he said with respect to India has been conciliatory, has been positive, has been stabilizing, including his decision to hand back the pilot that was felled when India sent over a few planes to flex its muscles. So I think on the whole, the onus will be on India, and I think the pressure on India is not just from the goodness being displayed by the Prime Minister, it's also coming from the shared interest in peace and stability in this region that both Russia and China are invested in.
Pakistan has always enjoyed close diplomatic and economic relations with China. China, of course, is financing that project in Pakistan known as CPEC, the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, and China is expecting a closer relationship under Imran Khan. In fact, the Chinese newspaper, the Global Times, said, and I'm quoting here, "Beyond doubt, Beijing expects a higher degree of engagement by the new Pakistani government in the CPEC." So how do you see relations with Beijing evolve during this Prime Minister's period in office?
I think when he came in, the Prime Minister's obsession with criticizing everything that the previous regime had done, the previous Prime Minister had done, got him into a little bit of trouble with Beijing, because part of what the previous administration had done is make Pakistan's part of the BRI essentially the crown jewel of the Belt and Road Initiative. That's what CPEC really is and was always meant to be. And in fact, in the 3.5 years that the previous government had to try and get things going on CPEC, there was a remarkable speed with which things were achieved. I think there's been a slowdown since Prime Minister Imran Khan took over, and I think largely it was driven not by any animus towards China necessarily, but by a core belief that everything the previous regime had done was tainted by corruption and needed to be rolled back. Sadly, one of the victims of that kind of blanket thinking at the part of the Prime Minister and his close allies, including his commerce advisor, was public criticism of CPEC, and that was not well received in Beijing. I think the message has been conveyed to the Pakistani authorities quite clearly that such messaging is not helpful for the shared vision that both Pakistan and China have, not just for the bilateral relationship, but for the wider array of relationships, both bilateral and multilateral, that these two countries believe that they can help forge. And of course, the SCO is one part of that, but there are others, including the CARIC program and other regional connectivity activities that Pakistan is expected to help lead and forge.
To what extent does domestic politics and domestic power shifts in Pakistan affect foreign policy? The country's former ambassador to the United States, Hussein Haqqani, he has a skeptical view of relations improving with India, for instance. He said in a recent opinion piece, which was in The Print, he said, based on the history of India-Pakistan relations, Prime Minister Narendra Modi has good reason to think that Pakistan tends to engage in talks with India for global respectability, but its dominant military is unable to shed its ideological aversion to normal ties with India. Is that a fair characterization of the relationship right now?
No, I don't think it is. I think that India is changing and evolving and has changed and evolved quite fast. And the rise of a religiously fueled extremism in that country has affected its posture, its foreign policy posture towards Pakistan. So quite contrary to the so-called ideological moorings of the Pakistani state or the Pakistani military, the real problem is the ideological shift taking place in India. But I also think that whether it's Pakistan or it's India, both countries would eventually act in a way that is aligned with the national interest. And I believe that the national interest in both countries, in Islamabad and Rawalpindi, as well as in New Delhi, the national interest in both countries is to find a way of not allowing disputes and disagreements to contaminate the wider regional agenda, which is connectivity, which is economic growth, and which is the ability of nations to get along and continue to grow their trade and their economies, even when they don't see eye to eye on everything.
One final question, Mosharraf. Foreign Policy magazine ran an article on Pakistan not so long ago and pointed out that 18 men or women have been elected or appointed to the office of Prime Minister in Pakistan since its founding in 1947. None have served out the entirety of their terms. Do you believe Imran Khan will serve out his term?
I think that it's immaterial whether anybody serves out their term. I think the more important question is whether the third consecutive timely election, which is a first in Pakistani history, whether this assembly will be able to see out its full term. So we had an election in 2008, and that assembly fulfilled its full 5-year term, and there was a peaceful transition of power. There was an election. It was largely free, fair, and credible, and it generated a new parliament. And that parliament was in power for 5 years. And there was an election that was, again, there were questions both in 2013 and in the recent 2018 election. There were irregularities. There was a degree of manipulation. But by and large, credible elections have produced a new assembly. So the key question is this assembly going to see out its term? I think it is. I think Pakistan has made a quantum shift in terms of its commitment to this process. Now the challenge is that the process needs to lead to outcomes. And until ordinary Pakistanis don't get to reap the benefits of substantially greater trade with China, with India, with Afghanistan, with the Central Asian states, with the Gulf states, until that trade doesn't begin to deliver prosperity to the Pakistani people, the question of a democratic process will continue to be, will continue to teeter in this realm of instability. But I think we're on the right path, and this assembly will fulfill its full 5-year term.
You know, the Prime Minister has not been in office for very long, less than a year, as we pointed out. What are the sort of benchmarks or markers that you would be looking for in the months and years ahead from this Prime Minister?
Look, this government, this Prime Minister is a rare occurrence in Pakistani political history because he is decidedly, and his party are decidedly, a pro-reform group of individuals and politicians. Of course, they've adopted and adapted many old, laundered politicians from other parties, people with corruption allegations, people who've been in power before. But at its core, the voter of this party and the supporter of this Prime Minister expects reform. So the key benchmark that I'll be looking for is fiscal reform. Are the rich people in Pakistan going to stop riding on the coattails of the middle class and the poor in this country, and are they going to start paying their fair share? And if that fiscal change takes place in Pakistan, then many of the problems that the country faces, including its indebtedness, including its need to go to the IMF, those problems begin to get solved. So over the next year, this government has an opportunity to demonstrate seriousness with respect to fiscal reform. And that should be the primary benchmark against which it's measured.
Mosharraf Zaidi, thanks for joining us, sir.
Always a pleasure, Anand. Thank you.
Let us continue our discussion right now with our panel. Joining me on set is Shuja Nawaz. He's a distinguished fellow with the South Asia Center at the Atlantic Council. Also in the studio is Kamran Bokhari. He's founding director at the Center for Global Policy and non-resident scholar at the Arabia Foundation. Welcome to both of you. Shuja, let me start with you. As we reported there earlier on, Imran Khan will be coming to the first year of his term as Prime Minister in August. Fighting corruption, as I talked with Mosharraf Zaidi there, was one of the central platforms of his campaign to become Prime Minister. He talked about it in a speech he made earlier this week to the nation. Let's watch part of that speech.
I am making a powerful commission. It will consist of the Federal Investigation Agency, Intelligence Bureau, Inter-Service Intelligence, Federal Bureau of Revenue, and the Security and Exchange Commission. All these government institutions will investigate how these people pushed this country into debt, which we are pulling it from.
Can he tackle corruption in Pakistan, or will he face considerable opposition from very entrenched interests in the country?
It's going to be an uphill battle, and it's not just this battle. Imran Khan, who is a different kind of politician, he is not a politician who belongs to a dynasty. Pakistan has been subjected to musical chairs of dynastic politics for the last 3 or 4 decades. One way or the other, they have endeared themselves either to autocratic rulers, or when they've been elected themselves, they've kept things within the dynasty. He represents a different kind of politician. He's a populist. He also has identified various fronts on which to wage war. Corruption is one of them. The other is the creation of a welfare state modeled after the early principles of the Prophet Muhammad in Medina. And so he's committed himself to those, but those are long-term visions.
Yeah.
And I don't think he has the time nor the ability to make those kinds of radical institutional systemic changes. His principal problem remains economic, followed by an existential threat due to militancy inside the country, as well as an abiding threat from a hegemonic India to the east. So he has to try and face all of these at the same time, and he's only been in office for 10 months.
Yeah, he's got to manage it all at the same time. Kamran Bokhari, as we heard in our report, a number of high-profile politicians have been arrested, including the former president, President Asif Ali Zardari, for money laundering charges. Could Imran Khan be the leader that takes on the country's elite and holds them accountable?
In a partial way, perhaps. Of course, there is a lot of political capital to be gained from doing these arrests. As Shuja said, his challenge is economic, immediately, financial. So when you are not able to make that kind of change based on the expectations that you have set during the campaigning, then you focus on these areas, the low-hanging fruit, and say, look, I'm working on it, I'm facing uphill battle, and we're getting there. So it's in a way to say the economic reforms will come, but look, I am working, and one of the showcase pieces is I'm going after those who brought you to this point.
Shuja, what about his relationship with the military in Pakistan?
That's the big difference between him and the earlier governments of both the Pakistan People's Party as well as the Pakistan Muslim League Nawaz group. For the first time, we are seeing a kind of a genuine partnership between him and the army chief, who is now in his last few months of his tenure as the army chief. However, that close relationship is an unequal one, and it's, in the true sense of the French word, a misalliance, a marriage between unequal partners. And we know how many of those marriages end. So there may be issues there. However, on some key issues, it appears that there is some convergence of views, including on the question of resolving issues with India, because Pakistan, and particularly the military, I think, is now realizing that the bigger battle is internal. The existential threat is internal. We are still waiting to see exactly what moves this government and the military makes in that internal battle against militants that use Pakistan as a base for getting it into trouble with its neighbors to the west and the east.
Kamran, that is a complaint that we've heard from this country, the United States, complaining that Pakistan is not doing enough to crack down on terrorism. In fact, it manifested itself in some very undiplomatic tweets from President Trump. But now the Pakistani government says that it is cracking down. It shut down 4 terror camps. What can we infer from this with what Imran Khan plans to do?
I think that all the stakeholders of the Pakistani state are not totally on the same page, because their extremist groups, they come in various shapes and sizes and forms. So while there is a consensus of zero tolerance for those who fight the state, there are still certain groups that get away with things, and like the Lashkar-e-Tayyiba. Although we've seen arrests and from the pressure from the international community, part of the Financial Action Task Force saying, look, you can't, you're going to be blacklisted if you don't go after these groups. But I think that it's an issue of capacity as well. In all fairness to the state, they're trying to get a hold of these groups, but I think that the monstrosity is so large now. It's spread all across the Pakistani society. And as I said, there isn't one sort of nexus. This is a multi-headed hydra, and so it's going to take time. And I think that it's linked to India, it's linked to Afghanistan, and so we'll see. There's some progress, but definitely there needs to be done. A lot more needs to be done.
Shuja, we've got a few minutes left. I want to talk about the economy and the challenges that Imran Khan faces. He wants to increase the rate of economic growth, but he's borrowed from the IMF. He's going to have to implement austerity measures. And as you pointed out a moment ago, he wants to do something about lifting the poor in the country, creating this, what he called an Islamic welfare state. I mean, those are pretty big challenges for him, aren't they?
They are, but he can set the ground for it. He's just released his first year's budget, and the budget is focused on raising taxes, and that to an extent which Pakistan has never, ever raised that much money from tax revenue. I don't know if they have the capacity to do that, and I wonder what will be the state of the IMF program when they come for the first review. Whether this will go the way of many previous programs which had to be rescheduled. So that's one issue. The other is job creation and exports.
Yes.
Pakistan doesn't have the systems in place, the infrastructure, the logistics, the job force, the trained people in order to boost exports quickly. But over time, if they continue with these efforts, then maybe they will. I just want to add a footnote on this question of the militancy inside the country.
Yeah.
There has been a shift of rhetoric on the part of the military chief, for instance. He has been saying a number of times that only the state must have the monopoly of power within the country.
Right.
The question now is to see whether they'll deliver on that promise.
Kamran, we've only got about a minute left. Just I'm going to talk about foreign policy very quickly. There appears to be many moving parts in foreign policy because, as we talked earlier on, the relationship with China has been a close one. It's been one of cooperation. But we're also hearing that Pakistan is going to be conducting joint military exercises with Russia.
I think that from the Chinese point of view, that isn't that big of a problem. Because if you notice, China and Russia have this cooperation in Central Asia. They know that they need to work with each other to sort of balance out and deal with the moves by the United States. So I don't think that the Russian military exercises or Pakistan, gravitating towards Russia is going to cause a whole lot of consternation in Beijing. But I think that Pakistan is at a place where it's delving into too many issues at the same time.
Right.
There's the Iran versus Saudi arena. There is closeness now with Russia. We already have a very strong relationship with Beijing.
Yeah.
And the United States relationship is neither here nor there.
Yeah.
So we just got to wait and see.
And we have to leave it there. Thanks to both of you for being with us. Thank you very much. That is it for this edition of The Heat. I'm Anand Naidu in Washington, D.C. Thanks for watching.